For many years, Kaliningrad served as one of the most vital logistical gateways connecting Russia to Europe by land. It was essentially a truck highway junction, especially for transit traffic passing through Russia, Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania. Every day, hundreds of trucks and containers passed through this narrow corridor, making Kaliningrad Russia's gateway to the west. But this critical bridge has now been officially severed. A single-page decree instantly blocked Russia's vital lifeline to the west. On November 21st, Lithuanian Railways officially halted the critical transit of cargo belonging to Russian oil giant Lukoil to Kaliningrad. The Lithuanian side presented this not as an act of hostility, but as a purely pragmatic step to control business risks. However, this is not just a transportation issue. It is a matter of survival for a region that is home to more than 1 million people. Lukoil, one of Russia's largest energy giants, supplied a large portion of Kaliningrad's fuel needs by rail. This fuel was not only for civilian cars, it was also needed for generators that kept Kaliningrad's electricity grid running, buses, ambulances, and most importantly, to heat military barracks and warehouses to prevent freezing in winter. When this line was cut, the region's vital resources for fuel, heating, and electricity production suddenly faced the risk of vanishing. The threat of being left without heating and electricity in the middle of winter was a situation that created massive panic and internal pressure among the region's population. This was the moment when Putin's promise of a secure life plummeted below zero on the thermometer. The second and more ruthless arm of this vice was the roadblock hostage crisis. With the reopening of border crossings on November 20th, which Lithuania had closed a month earlier due to weather balloons carrying contraband, thousands of Lithuanian registered trucks stranded in Belarus were expected to return home. However, the Belarusian regime turned the situation into a hostage crisis. Belarus only allowed new trucks entering the country after the reopening of the borders to return to Lithuania. Thousands of trucks stranded in Belarus since the beginning of the month are still unable to leave and have been forcibly sent to paid parking lots. This restriction does not only apply to trucks that entered before customs. Conditions have also worsened for new trucks entering the country. Trailer swapping is no longer permitted. This technical restriction disrupts carriers' working conditions, causes customers to refuse to reload cargo, and increases the risk of damage. This was a diplomatic suicide, slowing down Russia's own logistics channels to Kaliningrad. The trucks stranded at the border represent not just the collapse of the transport sector, but the collapse of an entire ecosystem. Hundreds of small truck owners, small businesses, large transport companies going bankrupt or ceasing operations could leave thousands of truck drivers, warehouse workers, mechanics, and accountants unemployed overnight. The ancillary industries serving the transport sector will also collapse. Customs agencies, logistics warehouses, truck repair shops, tire dealers, gas stations, all will lose their main customers. This means thousands more unemployed. This logistical paralysis will spread to other sectors. Other factories in Kaliningrad that cannot bring in raw materials or ship their products will be forced to halt production. Stores will be unable to fill their shelves, and prices will skyrocket. Kaliningrad's logistics parks, port areas, and roadsides could be littered with thousands of trucks and lorries, their engines silenced, impounded, and no longer able to move. The technical dimension of the crisis also includes smuggling using weather research aircraft. According to data from the Lithuanian State Border Guard Service, border guards seized 10 smuggled air balloons containing approximately 12,300 packs of Belarusian cigarettes in just 2 days. These air vehicles were carrying contraband equipped with GPS tracking devices. Russia and its allies are pursuing a strategy of wearing down the West's infrastructure and security by using seemingly innocent vehicles in the grey areas of international law. However, this deepens Kaliningrad's logistical stranglehold by making Lithuania's threat to reclose its border checkpoints a constant one. In fact, as you may recall, Lithuania had previously restricted the passage of many cargoes due to EU sanctions. Kaliningrad's road and rail connections to the mainland were already crippled due to these sanctions. Local business representatives had admitted the consequences of this situation months ago. Cargo transportation had shifted from land to sea, but ferry queues had lengthened due to a shortage of ships. Some truck drivers stated that they had been forced to wait at ports for more than 2 months. The cost of transporting construction materials like cement by sea had skyrocketed to 420,000 rubles, a 6-fold increase from 70,000 rubles by road. Logistics companies described this situation not as a business issue, but as costs of unimaginable proportions. Now, Lukoil's petroleum products need to be integrated into this PARALYZE system via sea transport. LTG transported a total of 371,000 tons of petroleum products to Kaliningrad in 2024. Of this, 345,000 tons, or almost all of it, belonged to Lukoil, which is now on the sanctions list. This is Kaliningrad's civilian fuel. This is the fuel for Kaliningrad's tanks, ships, and jets. This is the lifeblood of Putin's stronghold, the Baltic Fleet. Putin will have to transport Russian oil to Kaliningrad from St. Petersburg ports at record costs. Oil is not a basic foodstuff or construction material. It is vital fuel for heating and transportation in a region. Logistics costs, which have already increased by 70 to 100%, could reach nightmarish proportions with the oil cut-off. This logistical collapse is hitting the public and the business world directly. Kaliningrad's industrial production index fell by almost a quarter in May compared to last year due to sanctions. Major automotive and motorcycle manufacturers in the region, Avtotor and Bolt Motors, halted operations overnight. Nearly half of the vehicles belonging to over 1,000 transport companies are experiencing cargo shortages. This issue directly affects 15,000 to 18,000 workers. These individuals could lose their jobs. In the shadow of this logistical paralysis, the situation of the Russian military garrison in Kaliningrad is also deteriorating from within. The fleet is operationally paralyzed due to fuel shortages. The launchers for Iskander missiles have become static targets, unable to move due to lack of fuel. Russian military commanders are witnessing that Moscow cannot even provide security within its own territory or deliver supplies. And this situation is further exacerbating the collapse of morale. This is not just an ordinary economic crisis, it is the collapse of Putin's 25-year promise of stability. The warning from Alexei Chadayev, a former advisor to the Russian parliament, is becoming a concrete reality in Kaliningrad. In other words, the primitive barter economy of the 1990s is returning. The people of Kaliningrad were trying to believe in Putin's war, but now they see that Putin, in order to maintain his power, is confronting them with hunger and misery. That is, with the conditions of the 1990s, his own political nightmare. Lithuania's single railway move clearly highlights the difference in opinion between Putin and the people. So, what are the alternatives? Technically, it is possible to reach St. Petersburg via the Baltic Sea on ships departing from the port of Kaliningrad. However, this cannot be a primary logistics route. The sea transport capacity between Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg cannot even come close to the volume transported by road. The ports cannot handle such a load. There are not enough ro-ro or container ships. Sea transport is many times more expensive than road transport. Ship fuel costs, port fees, insurance premiums, and longer travel times will drive up the cost of every product arriving in or departing from Kaliningrad. A shipment that takes a few days by road can take weeks by sea. This is a disaster for fresh food or urgent industrial parts. In a war environment, Russian civilian ships in the Baltic Sea could potentially become legitimate targets for Ukrainian naval drones or other threats. Ukraine's successes against Russian ships in the Black Sea have already proven how risky sea-based resupply is. Air resupply, meanwhile, is only viable for the most urgent military or medical needs, and is completely inadequate and astronomically costly for sustaining the economic life of a million-strong population. Kaliningrad was thus entirely dependent on these transit routes through Polish and Lithuanian territory to survive. However, the balloon crises between Belarus and Lithuania turned the border gates into ticking time bombs. To understand the origins of this bureaucratic trap and logistical stranglehold, we must look at Kaliningrad's special status from the Soviet era to the present day, and the timeline showing how NATO gradually turned this status into a weakness. Kaliningrad was historically the German city of Königsberg. After World War II, it was annexed by the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, Kaliningrad was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. a strategic dagger in the heart of NATO territory on the Baltic Sea. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia continued to heavily militarize this exclave. It was one of the main bases of the Baltic Fleet, and the location where Iskander M, short-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, were deployed. These missiles could directly threaten Warsaw, Berlin, and Copenhagen. For Vladimir Putin, Kaliningrad was a psychological weapon and a tool for blackmail against NATO. This fortress myth was vital for Russian domestic propaganda. Even if NATO surrounds us, we have a fortress in their heartland. However, this doctrine had a fatal flaw: geography. The fortress was surrounded by enemy territory, and its only lifeline was transit corridors passing through that enemy territory. The first serious blow to the fortress myth came in June 2022, just a few months after the invasion of Ukraine. Lithuania decided to restrict rail transit to Kaliningrad, citing EU sanctions against Russia. According to Reuters at the time, the Kremlin reacted, annoyed, angrily, accusing Lithuania of hostile actions and threatening to retaliate to protect its national interests. But what was the outcome? Russia bluffed and lost. Lithuania was a NATO member, and an attack on it would have triggered a war with the entire alliance. Putin, stuck in the Ukraine quagmire, couldn't risk that. The crisis was resolved with the EU's intervention, but NATO clearly saw how much of a strategic weapon Kaliningrad's transit dependency was. Learning from the railway crisis, NATO made its next move more subtly. They targeted road transit. This was not a single sudden ban, but a months-long, gradually escalating bureaucratic strangulation operation. According to Forbes in February 2023, Poland closed the key border crossing with Belarus at Bobrovniki for security reasons, effectively halting the passage of Russian and Belarusian trucks. Lithuania similarly slowed customs checks and demanded additional documents. The result? Truck queues stretching for miles formed at the borders. Trucks were forced to wait for weeks. This made it difficult for Moscow to cry, "blockade," but the effect was devastating. NATO was slowly crippling the Russian transport sector. And this timeline brings us to the final move on November 21st, 2025. The railway had been tested in June 2022, and Poland had slowed down the road transport in February 2023. Now it was time to deliver the final blow. Lithuania's halting of cargo belonging to Russian oil giant Lukoil traveling to Kaliningrad was the final step in this legal blockade. Could Putin respond militarily? When the EU tried sanctions in 2022, he yelled, threatened, and Germany backed down in fear. But this time, there are no political decisions from Brussels. Instead, he faces a financial execution order from the US Treasury. Who will he invade? A SWIFT code? A bank transaction? In short, Kaliningrad is no longer a fortress, but a hostage. Lithuania's cold, calculated decision and the Belarusian regime's extortion policy have driven Russia's most critical military presence in the West into a logistical blockade. This is not just a fuel shortage problem, it is the shattering of Putin's myth of an impregnable fortress. This domino effect, which began with the cutting off of Lukoil cargoes, leaves Kaliningrad's internal front facing the threat of collapse in the middle of winter. Russia's Baltic Fleet and Iskander missiles will become mere decorations when they run out of fuel, and the Kremlin's power in the West will be wiped out. Moscow's ability to respond urgently is trapped in a corner due to the risk of military and economic retaliation. This logistical strangulation fundamentally undermines Russia's military doctrine and political authority. Once an invincible military headquarters, it is now a victim of international chaos. Kaliningrad is gone. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.